So thank you very much. Thank you, Ashay, also for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Um, so what I'll be talking about today in the next 45 minutes, it's not really so much a paper as trying to gather different kinds of work, including academic papers, but also other kinds of writing that we have been doing at the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. So the work that I'm presenting is very much a collaborative effort between postdocs, RAs, other faculty members at our center, as well as people that we've been collaborating with outside, including I will especially mention Radhika Kapoor from ICRIER. I'll be presenting a kind of an overview of our work on the impact of the pandemic, specifically the nationwide lockdown, but also subsequent to that, the recovery process and how that's going in terms of employment and income in particular. I will end with some remarks on what has been the policy response so far and what can be done going ahead, seeing the situation that is evolving. So that is the plan. Let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. I'll start with a brief introduction and then talk about the employment and income effects, both in terms of the impact of the lockdown and the recovery, as well as then go on to the policy response and its effectiveness and conclude with the way ahead. So it's worth reminding, something that is now a little bit easier to forget with the massive shock that we are experiencing to the economy this year, that even before the COVID-induced disruption, the Indian economy had been slowing down for several quarters. And there are a lot of causes sort of out there in literature. I'm using the term causes a little bit loosely. It's not like we always can pin down the causal relationships, but broadly, we think that these were the factors that were responsible for the slowdown, including short-run things like demonetization and GST rollout, adjustments to that, which were largely worked out before the crisis. But then the medium-run factors like the twin balance sheet problem that Arvind Subramanian has talked a lot about, and the related NPA crisis, and the long-run structural weaknesses of the Indian economy, which are all too well known to really bear much repetition here. All of these contribute to my third point here, which is a weak link between employment growth, structural change, and GDP growth. So there are two things. Even when the economy was growing very fast, we were not able to translate it into employment growth and structural change to the extent that we would have liked. And then in the recent quarters, with the slowdown, of course, the problem became even more accentuated. And now with COVID, it's a different magnitude or order of challenge altogether. There are certain specific structural vulnerabilities, we can call them, which make the COVID impact particularly severe. It's not an India-specific thing, but certainly India does have these qualities. The highly impacted sectors are also large employers. I've given some examples there. The dominant nature of employment in these highly impacted sectors is precarious, with little or no job security. And there is little or no social protection available via employers. These factors, that the large part of the workforce is in highly impacted sectors in precarious conditions, is really what accounts for most of the impact. And from a social protection point of view, the safety net is mostly rooted in domicile and not where workers work. So things like PDS and Manrega. This was discussed in the morning by Karthik Muralidharan, which also reminds me that I would like to apologize to the organizers that I actually missed a lot of the talks because of teaching and other duties during the day. So pardon me if I'm repeating things that have already been done. I will try to draw on whatever I've heard so far in the day. These are kind of the employment arrangement related vulnerabilities that make it, make the impact severe. And then the fifth point is that there is some evidence that social identities also matter to who suffered more beyond the occupational and industrial segregation. So, there are gender and caste effects, for example, that we observe that cannot simply be explained by the fact that women or lower castes tend to work in certain kinds of occupations or under certain kind of employment arrangements. So that's also something worth keeping in mind. And there have been some studies recently which put together the pre-COVID PLFS data on informal employment together with the nature of the containment measures to produce some estimates of job loss. And the actual measurements of job loss that I'll be presenting today also match these predictions. The recovery, very quickly, just in terms of the introduction, I will go into this a little bit later. The recovery is heterogeneous, to say the least. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it's confusing as to what exactly is going on currently. There are high frequency indicators that indicate quick recovery in several sectors. I think most of you would be familiar. The Mint has been doing a good job of publishing many of these. But then there are others, such as repayments on loans that are increasingly failing now that moratoria are being lifted and people are not able to meet their EMIs and so forth. So that points to certain continued distress. Broadly, I think it's not unreasonable to say that the bottom 50% likely continue to be affected, either because they still don't have jobs, or they have the jobs are back, but the incomes are not back, or jobs and incomes might be back, but there's an accumulated debt due to the huge hole in employment and income over the last few months, or there is reduced consumption at the household level. All of these things, I think, likely are going on, and there is some evidence. Unfortunately, there are no national estimates. We don't have any reliable official data on this, with a few exceptions. And the major exception is the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, CMIE, whose consumer pyramid survey I'll be presenting some data from a little bit later, which is nationally representative data. It's not official data, but nevertheless, it's the only kind of recent information available to us on these things. Now, the counterpoint to what I'm saying, I've just got a quote here from an unnamed Finance Ministry official from a recent Indian Express article, which kind of nicely summarized, what would be the counterpoint to what my main point here today is, which is we need a lot more additional fiscal support to counteract the effects of the pandemic. The point here being made is that the top 10% in the country anyway consume more than the bottom 50. And so, the bottom 50 can't really spend much less. Discretionary spending might be low, but their expenditure on essentials is unlikely to fall much further. And the rich have started spending again. So then, we shouldn't really worry too much because most of the purchasing power is in a section which is now starting to spend, and the rest who are not able to spend, well, they don't spend too much to begin with. Now, I think this is the wrong way to look at it for many reasons, and I'll elaborate on some of those later. So let me get a little bit into the data on the impact on recovery as far as employment and incomes go. This is the open unemployment rate as measured by the CMIE CPHS, which is right now the most quoted indicator. It's high frequency and also the only nationally representative employment indicator. And you can see the familiar story here. There was a large increase in open unemployment in April and May, but then it has quickly come back to pre-lockdown levels. The main caveat here is that open unemployment rate is not a good indicator of labor market health right now, for the reason that the people have withdrawn from the workforce, from the labor force, so they won't show up in the unemployment statistics. And there are people who are nominally employed, but earning zero incomes or very, very negligible incomes. And that would have been the case in June, July, August. Certainly, I don't know if that would continue to be the case in September, October, because the income data is not yet available for those months. But we do know that up till August, there's a significant proportion of people who are technically employed. Let's say they are self-employed. They have businesses to run, but they have no earnings. So open unemployment for both these reasons is not a very good indicator. The WPR, the worker population ratio, is better because it takes into account the out of the labor force section in the sense that's missing from this indicator. So we can see who actually has work, not just who declares themselves to be unemployed. And there you see that the recovery is slower, although it's slow particularly for women. So on this graph, I'm showing you the WPR for men and women. The axes are different here to note that in the CMI data, women's WPR is very, very low, much lower, in fact, even than the PLF that observed in the PLFS, which is anyway low because in India, the women's work participation rate is low. But what is 20% in the PLFS is 10% or less in CMI. So, there's still there's some things here to be explained, which I don't have time to go into today. But what I want to bring to your notice is that whether you look at the male or female rate, both took of course, a sharp nosedive in the lockdown period of April. They were back, starting to go back by August. Now these data are our own calculations based on CMI unit level data. So they end in August because we don't have the data subsequent to that yet. Most of my findings from CMI will be limited to until August. However, we see that women's recovery is particularly slow compared to men's. And I'll come back to this point later, when I put some numbers on this. I want to give you some indication of what happened during the lockdown based on a different data source. These are small purposive surveys that were carried out by many people, including us, to gauge the employment effects of the lockdown during the months of April and May. And most of these surveys show what I'm showing you here, which is fairly substantial employment losses compared to the baseline. So most of these surveys, what they did was they asked people compared to February, did you do any work in April or in the reference week? If you did any work, did you earn any income and so forth? So what we see is that broadly the urban labor force was hurt more, and we know this from many sources, partly because it's a farming effect, that there were people who were able to continue in farming in the rural areas, while that was not an option in the towns. And you see large percentage losses in employment for self-employed workers, for casual wage workers, for regular salary workers. Of course, there are differences between how impacted they are, but to the first order, they are all highly impacted by job loss during the lockdown. Regular wage workers, I want to emphasize this point, that our survey and other surveys found that there was a substantial impact. About half of regular wage workers reported either that they did not receive a salary or they received reduced salary, or that their hike was withheld. And this continued, unfortunately, to be the case anecdotally, even beyond the lockdown. So we are looking at a substantial income loss over the months of April, May, June, and potentially later as well. To show you findings from 3 surveys, 3 purposive, these are purposive, I'm emphasizing, because they are not random surveys. So you can't generalize to the national picture or the workforce or something like that. These are pertaining to the sample, but nevertheless, they are large sample surveys and they are geographically diverse. They are occupationally diverse. And moreover, they agree with each other in the broad magnitude of impact. So our survey, I've already talked about what the employment loss was. To that, I've added here the Action Aid and Dalberg surveys, all of whom show in the urban particularly nearly 80% employment losses. Right? So these are vulnerable groups. These are purposive surveys that target particular groups who are likely to lose employment. That is why their numbers are also higher than what you might find in a typical random nationally representative survey, such as the CMI, for example. Right? But this gives us a picture of what would have happened to those people who were in a vulnerable position. We did some simple kind of regression analysis just to see, controlling for certain obvious things, what was the effect of being in a particular kind of employment. Were you more or less likely to lose work and so forth? And the results are not that surprising. Farmers were significantly less likely to lose work. That doesn't mean that they were not impacted in a different kind of way, but at least in terms of employment, they were not that affected compared to workers in construction, trade, and so forth. And the urban self-employed were the hardest hit in many of these areas, because they were practically unable to operate at all for a couple of months. The migrant worker point has been made well enough. I don't think I need to go into all of that. It was headline news for a couple of months. Let me come back to some of the nationally representative CMI estimates and spend a couple of minutes on what we know in terms of the extent of job loss in April in particular. So we estimate, based on the fall in the worker population ratio that is observed in the CMI data, that about 120 million workers would have lost work in April. What I'm showing you here is certain baseline periods compared to reference periods. And the reason these particular periods show up here on the x-axis is because our study is a panel which follows the same households over time. The CMI survey follows, interviews the same household multiple times a year. So households that are interviewed, for example, in April would be interviewed again in August, again in December, again, and so on. So we are comparing April to August or August, to December, December to April kind of transitions. And what you see here is that compared to the baseline in 2019, December 2019 to April 2020, there is a huge fall in absolute employment. Right? So these are the jobs that have disappeared in the lockdown. Now they do come back, right? So if you look at the blue, which is the male, there's a significant recovery. But if you look at the red, okay, which is of course small to begin with, because as I said in the CMI data, women, the female employment is low to begin with, but the recovery is very muted for women. So in proportionate terms, women actually have a very muted, slow recovery. In absolute terms, they don't show up much because they don't account for that much of the workforce. So this is the absolute numbers that I'm showing you. But in proportionate terms, if I just look at the percentage drop, then there's a much larger impact actually for women and a much smaller recovery from April to August. Right? So the heterogeneous nature of the recovery is very clear from these data. I'll show you another way of looking at the same kind of thing. What we have done here, and this work we'll be presenting in much more detail on Tuesday in the CMI seminar that's coming up. There's a registration link out there somewhere, I think, that you can find. We'll be presenting this paper there. What we have done is look at, again, the panel of households that were interviewed in December 2019, April 2020, and August 2020. So we follow them and we ask, okay, what are the proportion of people who showed no impact, who retained their employment all the way through, or which I'm calling here no effect, or who recovered, meaning they lost their job in April but recovered in August, or who did not recover. So meaning they lost work in April and continued to have no work in August. And here again, the differences between men and women are very stark, both in terms of the no effect. Fully 60% of men have no effect, while only 16% of women fall in that category. And if you look at the no recovery, then fully 50% of women still had not recovered as of August, while that number is much smaller for men. Right? So that's another way of looking at the dual impact on women, is that they were much more likely to lose employment and much less likely to gain it. Now, there are some other results that we have in terms of caste and so forth, which I will not go into now in the interest of time, because I want to go into the policy measures. So let me skip over those. If you're interested in those, I can, please do attend the CMI seminar. Before going on to the policy, I want to spend a few minutes on what we know about incomes. Okay, this is all about employment. Income data, again, is hard to come by, but we do have some of these COVID surveys, and we have some indication from there what happened. So in the APU survey, we found that incomes fell by 40 to 50%. Right? In the Dalberg survey, again, the average decline is something like 65% in monthly income. And particularly agricultural laborers, construction workers, urban self-employed, these are again the same groups that show up in terms of huge dent in the income earned for a couple of months. And moreover, the lower quintiles are more affected than the upper quintiles. This is also something that you see in the LSE Center for Economic Performance survey. which, yeah, I have it here, which is a random survey. So that's there we have more a more heterogeneous sample. There are some high income earners in that sample too. Even there, the mean earnings loss is 48%. And workers in the lower income quartiles experience bigger income losses. So one very important point that comes out of that, the LSE survey, is that there is an increase in income inequality as a result of this. And we don't have too much data on this, in a rigorous quantitative sense, but I think it's safe to say that inequality has probably risen quite sharply this year. And one result of this income decline has, of course, been increased indebtedness. So again, in the Dalberg survey, you find that already at the end of May, a lot of debt had accumulated with households, with the number reaching 100% of a monthly income. Households had borrowed 100% of monthly income just to meet expenses, essential expenses. And I'm emphasizing this point because even if the recovery occurs, this debt can stay, right? So this buildup of debt, particularly informal debt, is going to be quite a serious overhang as we go ahead, and it's going to depress demand. Right? So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. Because as incomes come back, households will want to pay down the debt. Okay, one last point that I want to make here, just in terms of the shock, is that from the MSME end also there are some evidences emerging. There is the survey that in fact has been done by Lead at Kriya with along with Game, which has some very interesting data which follows micro enterprises over time and looks at what was the impact of the lockdown and then subsequently. And not surprisingly, they find that huge number of enterprises, the majority had hardly any cash reserves. By the end of the lockdown, they had to borrow to stay afloat, dip into savings, and so forth. There are also reports in newspapers and so forth of distressed sale of assets from MSMEs to survive. So all of which is going to have an effect on output going forward as well. So, we are not only talking about a short-term impact that will quickly reverse in a sort of V-shape, so to speak. It is quite possible that it has long-term consequences if productive capacities are hit for these small enterprises, right? And one point that I want to make here is that as far as an assistance like ECLGS is concerned, the Emergency Credit Loan Guarantee Scheme, which is essentially making cheaper liquidity available, there are two problems here. One, that enterprises may not borrow because they fear demand not returning. So it's not anymore just a liquidity crisis. It can also turn into a solvency crisis, which is not going to be solved by cheaper loans. And then the other thing is that as surveys like the Lead Kriya survey show, only 14% of overall borrowing in the sample came from formal sources in the first place. So many micro enterprises are not in the net to be able to avail of these things. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion on fintech in the preceding sessions. So maybe in the discussion we can get into some of these things. How do we use either existing infrastructure or put in place new things to at least solve this problem? I mean, we can't solve the demand problem this way through fintech, but we can solve the accessibility problem. What has happened since August is much less clear, at least in these data, because the CMI data beyond the headline unemployment rate are not available. And the targeted COVID surveys also mostly provide information only till about July or so. There is a recent survey that has come out by Hunger Watch, which is again a purposive survey of vulnerable households conducted in September, October, which does show continued income effects. So this survey finds that 43% of these households had no income in April and May. Of these, 56%, so half of those still had no income in September, October, or had reduced incomes and so forth. Only 3% were back to pre-lockdown income levels. So it's a long process, right? It's several months of depressed incomes that we're talking about. And there are administrative and high frequency data like the Manrega demand data or the EMIs, bounce rates and so forth that are coming out that can help us put some numbers on this. Okay, so let me come now to the policy response and its effectiveness. I think here I can go quickly through some of these things because most people know what has already been done. So the additional spending, additional fiscal outlay came primarily in the form of the free PDS grains, expanded Manrega outlay, the Jan Dhan transfers, and some one-time NSAP payments. This is at the union government level. I'll come to the states later. At the union government level, these were the large additional fiscal outlays, and then there was some front loading and rerouting of funds that happened. So PM Kisan funds, these were not additional outlays, these were front loading of funds that were supposed to be spent later, and then the PM Rozgar Abhiyan, which again consolidated various funds and accelerated the spending, right? So in mission mode, it tried to spend the money that had already been allocated under various heads to create work, particularly in the migrant receiving, in the reverse migrant districts. And similarly for BOCW funds and so forth. These are mostly not new spending. It's trying to do something with the existing outlays. And then there are, of course, the liquidity-based measures, which are by far the large ones. I've given only one example here, but the headline number, when we talk about India's fiscal response or India's response, stimulus response, the big numbers like 10% of GDP and so forth don't really, they don't mean additional fiscal outlay. It's all of this combined. And if you remove the below the line liquidity type of measures, then the additional fiscal outlay, this point has been made, I think, earlier by other speakers too, is low as far as India is concerned. There's some disagreements about exactly what it is, but it's something like 2 to 4% of GDP. Now, of course, there's a lot of controversy here about whether we have room to spend and so forth, which I can go into in the discussions if people are interested. What do we know about the effectiveness of these measures? Well, we know that PDS had the widest reach, followed by Manrega and cash transfers. And this is mainly from the COVID impact surveys that we know this, but we also know it from administrative data, which tells us what the coverage of these schemes is. Now, there have been no further cash transfers since June, at least at the union government level. But I'd like to note that the average cash transfer for globally for low middle income countries in which India comes is about 10 times larger than what we have done. Okay, so this is the World Bank Gentilini et al. Paper that is the compilation of cross-country policies. The average cash transfer there is about 40% of GDP per capita for 3 months, is what many countries have done. Now, we've not done anything close to that. 40% of GDP for us would mean something like 6,000 rupees a month for 3 months. But as you know, most of our transfers was much smaller than that. The PDS extra entitlements also, as far as I know, expired in November end. I'm not sure that they were extended, but I'm willing to be corrected if somebody knows. But even when they were present, they only reached NFSA holders, NFSA card holders. Of course, states had extended it beyond NFSA because they were at the front line and they had to do these things. But at the national level, that was not the case. And then Manrega, I don't have time to go into too much details here, but I'll refer people who are interested to some excellent work that is being done by this group called the People's Action for Employment Guarantee, which puts out these Narega trackers, they are called. They've put out 3 of them, I think, so far. The latest one being in November, for November. So they look at the MIS, the Narega MIS, and they summarize some good information on, what is the demand and what is the supply of the work. What are we looking at in terms of how many more people are signing up for it? Are they getting it or not? And this is, of course, a very good indicator of, whether there's continued distress or not, particularly when you compare it to the baseline. So we do know that, for example, in June, there was a huge increase, a 50% increase compared to the previous year's comparable month in terms of, people who got employment. But there is still large unmet demand. The households are not getting 100 days of work. In most cases, the average days of work have actually fallen, and not much funds remain to last the remainder of the financial year. So it's most likely that states will run out of funds pretty soon as far as Narega is concerned. I mentioned briefly that states have been doing interesting things. So, for example, PDS, even before the crisis, of course, many states go beyond the NFSA list. But during the crisis, they expanded the list to include APL households as well as non-card holders. They tried to reach more people, people on the waiting list and so forth, who don't have eligible cards. In terms of cash transfers, many states again augmented the basic Jan Dhan transfer to targeted groups, cab drivers, weavers, migrant workers, and so forth. And sometimes these were substantial cash transfers, although most of them were one time, 4,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees, and so forth. We don't know to what extent they reached people. I haven't seen too much systematic data on that. Andhra Pradesh also experimented with this home delivery of cash for people who were not able to reach common service points and so forth. The most interesting thing from my perspective is these new public works programs that we are seeing, which are sometimes called urban employment guarantees, but they're not really true guarantees. There are programs like that in Odisha, in Himachal, and in Jharkhand. And I've given the names here for those who would like to look them up. These are all COVID-specific urban public works programs introduced to create employment. And I think one of the big things that stood out when we look at the social safety net is that it is much better in the rural areas, including PDS, and of course, NREGA only operates there. So the urban poor were sort of doubly hit. They were not only more badly hit compared to the rural poor as far as the pandemic went, but they also had access to fewer safety nets. Now, in normal times, the lack of the urban safety net doesn't matter so much because employment is not that hard to come by. It's not like the rural economy where you have several months of lean seasons and so forth. But now it mattered a lot. So let me take the last maybe 10 minutes to talk about where do we go from here. I'm going to limit my remarks mostly to the safety net aspect. There are many things to do, obviously, in the medium to long run, which are more to do with job creation and structural change. And that can be discussed in the discussion if people are more interested in those issues. But here I want to limit myself to the social protection aspects. Is additional fiscal support needed? Yes. I don't know what more to say here. I think hopefully I have convinced you at least partly. If I haven't, then I can do so more in question answers. What can we do? Right? So if we want to go by the lower middle income country average that I talked about earlier, then we could do more cash transfers. There are people who are saying that it's too late. The right time to do cash transfers was in April, May, June. However, I don't think so. I mean, I think there are continued income effects. There are continued disemployment effects going on. There is indebtedness. So I think that an additional cash transfer now can help in paying down debt and even just simply restoring consumption and demand. So I think we should still do it. Expanding MNREGA entitlement is also a good idea. 150 days is a provision that is already in the Act. Nothing needs to change if you want to do that. And revising the program wage upwards to meet state minimum wages would also help, because NREGA wages right now are quite a bit lower than state minimum wages in many states. So both of those would be good to do. We have written quite a bit about a possible national urban employment guarantee program. There was some news coming out in September that the government was considering it, but I think it seems to have been shelved now. But I'm happy to discuss further on how it would work and so forth. PDS, I think it's clear that one big problem was the portability of benefits. So universalizing it would be a good idea. Again, that does involve additional fiscal outlay. So all of these things are not cheap. None of these points on this slide is really cheap, but they really will go a long way, not in immediate distress, in resolving immediate distress, in restoring aggregate demand, and also I would argue as an investment to future productivity. We should not look at them as purely dole. For example, in NREGA's case, there's plenty of evidence that it does also create important rural assets, as would be the case for an urban program as well. So these are not by any means purely transfers for distress. They can do other things too, but they are also needed from the point of view of hardship going on right now. In terms of medium to longer run social protection, this is definitely a great opportunity to think about our social protection systems and how to expand them in quality and reach. Of course, we need a policy focus on scaling up enterprises and formalizing them. There's no debate about that. So I'm not even really going into that. And that will help in what I've called the infra compliance agenda, the agenda of improving infrastructure and reducing compliances, improving the regulatory climate to allow enterprises to scale up and formalize, thereby making it easier to provide social security to workers. I mean, that agenda is, of course, a clear one. It needs to continue. But beyond that, I think there is other things that we could think about too, including a wider cash transfer net. I know that there was the presentation in the morning on the a universal income grant, and of course we can debate on whether this should be universal or targeted and so forth. But the emerging plumbing that we also heard about in the preceding talk, immediately preceding talk, the emerging plumbing that now exists should be used more and more for putting in place these measures. There is also a need to revisit an old idea which unfortunately has been jettisoned in the current the Social Security Act that was passed, the new act, which is the idea of an unorganized sector welfare board, suggested in the Unorganized Sector Act 10 years ago, and actually by the Sengupta Commission as well. Santosh Mehrotra has written about this in detail. I won't go into it. I refer you to his work about how do we ensure in a 10-year framework, this is not happening tomorrow, but over time, that there is actually a system in place for unorganized workers who are not disappearing anytime soon, even if the intra-compliance agenda goes forward. We're still looking at a largely informal economy for some years to come. And then, lastly, how do we put in place a micro enterprises policy net that can offer direct income support through enterprises if need be, or wage subsidies if need be. I'll end with this last sort of wish list, with an immediate wish list for the budget, just to put some numbers and some concrete, at least maintaining the current increased allocation of 1 lakh crores for the upcoming fiscal would be a good thing, I think. An increase of about 10% on last year's PDS budget would also help. This is largely filling in the hole that the NFSA has because it's based on 2011 population figures. So, just on updated population figures, the NFSA net should be wider. And this is what it does. The states have already done it. They've expanded, but states don't have the money, as we are repeatedly saying in the press. So, so it's not fair to burden them with what anyway the center should be doing. The NSAP, the pension is stuck at some very, very low amount of 200 rupees. Nominal amount never increased for about 10-15 years. That's not really acceptable and should be increased. And then finally, the most ambitious of all is an urban employment guarantee. It doesn't have to be national to start with. It can be a pilot scheme. It can cover the poorer districts. And we are doing some costing around that to see how much that would be. So I will end here again by thanking the organizers and re-emphasizing that most of what I presented was collaborative work with many researchers at our center, as well as others. And as you saw, the work of many other institutions and researchers too. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.